The following is a presentation of Geekster Media.
Remember that show back then? Remember that show? Turn on the TV, time was always flying. Why did they have to end? So many shows you forgotten. Now that we've got a podcast, we can release all the shows from our hands. Yeah, will you be? The most TV dudes you'll ever listen to. As long as we keep on talking sitcoms and cartoons from back in the day. Okay, we confess, we're obsessed, but we got a podcast to help you remember that show. Hey there, TV lovers, and welcome to episode 31 of Remember That Show, the podcast where we revisit the obscure or forgotten TV shows of the 80s and 90s. No one can stop me, but scum always tries. I'm Pope, Adam Pope, Jr.
And I learned the game from my Uncle James, but he never seems to be around anywhere. I'm William Bond West. But before we jump into the world of international adventure, we have to revisit our own TV-obsessed childhoods in a segment we call Theme Song.
So, Will, obviously our show today is dealing with the world of espionage. Always intriguing to children to be sneaking around. So I gotta ask, did you ever have dreams of being a spy? Or in your real life, find yourself doing surveillance work on friends or family?
Yeah. I mean, as a kid, they were always making like toys that lean that way. I mean, there's the Talk Boy recorder from Home Alone 2, where you could like record around corners and speed it up and trick people with the voice changer. But then there was like the spy tech stuff, you know, where it's like, ooh, a telescope in a ballpoint pen and things like that. I love gadgets. It was always that aspect. It was less so about like surveillance. I just like being sneaky and being able to use like gadgets. That was when I was a kid. Growing up, it has always intrigued me, but I never saw black spies in anything. And it's like you grow up and you find that like there is a use, like they will insert you in the black community and you're just like snitching on everybody to the CIA. But like they don't make movies about that, you know? So like I never saw it as like a career thing, but this is something some people know about me, some people don't. I don't say it a lot because it can come out kind of cringe, but like I used to have a job in commercial real estate where we cold called people about property for sale, right? But this was before like internet privacy was really a thing. Social media and all that stuff was new, so there weren't as many like safeguards to it. So during that era of my life, I got really good at tracking people down. Really good. Like I could find your divorce records, you know, like that kind of deal. And like things have changed and I'm a little rustier now. There was a good decade of my life where I like basically did a search on everyone I met, like just out of curiosity. And then like over time it tapered and now I don't even think about it. But there was a time where it's like, oh, new guy at work, let's see what happened at your last job. I have the mentality. I've just never really found fruitful or gainful employment using my powers.
That is wild. Yeah, and I recall, past guest appearances on my Wizards podcast. You've done all this research on people who like wrote into the magazine and you've like found where are they now. So yeah, definitely you have the skills. I have to say for me, those Tyco Spy Tech toys were a huge part of my childhood. Like I would work extra chores just to buy another Spy Tech kit because they had there was a collapsible binocular set, which I just loved. Like the fact that you could pop out the lenses and it had all these other features to it. I remember the most disappointing one was a pair of sunglasses that were mirrored on like the peripheral of the inside of the lens so that you could see someone sneaking up behind you. And I was like, this is pointless. I don't think anybody's following me, but there was also another set that was a notepad, but it was kind of inside this case and it had disappearing ink that you wrote your notes on, but then it also had an alarm. So if someone tried to get to your secret documents, it would go off. There was always something awesome. And I didn't feel the need to spy on an actual person, but I had lots of imaginary adventures. I saved the world multiple times with missions involving those gadgets, and a lot of times I'd build my own too. So I was kind of the IQ for myself, improvising something to get out of a jam. So I had a lot of fun with spy tech toys for sure. I will say the only like surveillance thing I did once, and talking about cringe, right? This is probably like fourth or fifth grade. There was a sixth grade girl who I thought was really cute. And I just remember I had those cameras, which I'm pretty sure Spytech had one that was inside a Reese's peanut butter cup package, that it was a camera. I just had one of the standard like slim camera things. But I remember her friends and her were sitting on some lunch tables at recess or something one day. And I just ran by and like took a picture of her real quick and took off. And then one of her guy friends ran me down. He's like, "Hey, what are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, my bad, my bad. I'm a total creeper," which I was.
And it wasn't even like in the cloud. You're like, I gotta go develop this. I gotta go to the dark room. You have nothing to worry about.
Yeah, it was not very good surveillance. So yeah, that was my one moment where I was just like, yeah, I'm not so stealth. I shouldn't be doing this. I shouldn't be doing it anyway. I learned very quickly.
I also built gadgets too, like out of constructs. I was building like grappling hooks that couldn't support my weight. But like you mentioned two important spy tech toys. I too have that notepad with the alarm. It's somewhere around here, but like that was like the only one I ever got. But he's like quickly becoming a recurring character on this show. Rich kid Eric, who had everything, had those sunglasses with the mirrors. So I remember what you're talking about. But the weird thing is like they don't even work when you're wearing the sunglasses. You kind of have to like pull them off like a cool 80s kid and like tilt them a little bit, and then you can use the mirror. So
yeah, and they're also extra big. Like that's the thing too. Like they don't make sense. They're not functional the way you think they're gonna be. So
they have to fit all kid heads, including the ones with encephalitis. So
well, Will, in my little surveillance mission, I definitely got the red light, but we want to find out how this cartoon got the green light.
For those of you who have been on the run from various governments and hiding out in remote areas of the world for the last 70 years, James Bond was the super spy hero of a series of novels by Ian Fleming starting in 1953, which were then adapted into a franchise of films starting with Dr. No in 1963 that are still being made into the present day. The hallmarks of James Bond, or Agent 007 as he's known, include his various spy gadgets created by the ingenious Q branch of MI6, his preference for drinks to be shaken, not stirred, sexual encounters with women for both business and pleasure, plus cool vehicles outfitted with many deadly bells and whistles. Bond is the template on which nearly all spies in entertainment are based, or at the very least measured against. Adam, were you a Bond fan growing up?
Well, here's the thing, Will. You just mentioned once again your rich kid Eric. I had my rich kid Eric, and he is the one who introduced me to James Bond. Like his parents let him watch all the R-rated movies. He was the one telling me about Aliens and Friday the 13th and all that kind of stuff. But the first Bond movie I ever saw was at his house, and it was Thunderball. And so I remember him also that day describing You Only Live Twice to me. So I started getting the idea, oh, it's a franchise. There's lots of movies with the same character. And also at the beginning of those tapes, I'm pretty sure there was like the quick hits, like here's the entire Bond collection on VHS. And I remember seeing the Goldfinger clip. Do you expect me to talk? No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die. And like that intrigued me so much. I was like, that is clever dialogue, even as like a 7-year-old. I'm like, this is awesome. So like I went and rented that for Blockbuster Video, but I only watched like 2 or 3 Sean Connery Bond films. I had no idea about Roger Moore or Timothy Dalton or George Lazenby, any of that, like until years later. But really, after watching Goldfinger, I just kind of lost interest in the character. I'm like, oh, it's for old people. You know, like this really isn't something I can connect to. But I do remember just the era of this happening because it was like the New Adventures of He-Man era. So this is like 1990. I remember Eric having those toys in hand while we were watching the movie. But that was just before James Bond Jr. premiered. So it was a good primer for what was to come. But James Bond Jr. for me really was like my big, like, ooh, I kind of like James Bond. It was through this cartoon, but like the movies themselves, I finally did catch up and watch them all and get familiar with the whole history, the behind the scenes and all of that. But how about you, Will?
No. Like it's like we were saying how it's what every spy is compared to. So it's like it was in the pop culture zeitgeist. It was in the air. I knew of James Bond, but it wasn't really a fixture. I would love to say like my introduction to the franchise, I thought it was James Bond Jr., but like when I really think about it, and this is so like Will down the rabbit hole. My first Bond movie was The Living Daylights. And I remember that because it was airing on Fox the same night of the '89 earthquake, you know, when like the lights went out in the stadium and all that. I wasn't watching baseball. I think it like went off and I clicked over and I was like, oh, what's going on there? That's in my mind, but I remember nothing of it except for, yes, it's a Timothy Dalton Bond, and it had If You Ask Me To, which is a song I would later learn from Celine Dion, but it's performed by Patti LaBelle in the closing credits. So that's my like introduction to Bond. So I didn't have a real foundation when this cartoon started. That was James Bond to me because that cartoon's like 91, 92. It wouldn't be until let's say 8th grade. Back then, this is still the like Pierce Brosnan era. I want to say it's TNT, but there was one of those channels that would do like 12 Days of Bond, 13 Days of Bond. It kept increasing as they kept making movies, but like basically it would be like this 2-week period where they would just show the franchise. So like my friend Chris Brockman, I talked him into just like putting in a tape and pressing record and letting it run. So then I ended up getting like On Her Majesty's Secret Service and like a couple more, but the one that really like did it for me, and it's funny because it's everyone's least favorite, is Moonraker. Like Moonraker's my favorite Bond, and for me that's when we were off to the races. The timing matched up where I've seen all of the Brosnan Bonds and none of like Daniel Craig. And I know people say those are great movies and he's good as Bond. I know nothing about those, but for that like GoldenEye to what is it, Tomorrow Never Dies like era, I was all about Bond. So I have a very narrow view of who I think James Bond should be.
Well, and that's a good point though, because at the end of the 80s, James Bond disappears and then Pierce Brosnan is our Bond. Obviously, the video game did a lot to keep Bond very popular with young people. And so I think that is a very good point. For a lot of us, it was kind of like, well, maybe people are going to go back and rent the movies like I did eventually. But at the same time, you're just kind of like, well, no, GoldenEye's a pretty cool movie. Like this is all we need. And it's got a good video game that backs it up. Okay. And that seemed to be like, you know, the point at which pop culture for people our age were really saying, okay, yeah, James Bond could be something, but we should get into this a little bit more because, you know, you mentioned not seeing, you know, black spies around, but, you know, while James Bond was certainly the touchstone for the spy genre at the movies, there were many successful spies on TV over the years. For example, Robert Culp was teamed with future sitcom star and problematic figure Bill Cosby for 3 seasons of I Spy, which was groundbreaking at the time for having a black actor in the lead, not even just a black spy, but to see a black person as the lead of a show. And then at the same time, another comedian and future Inspector Gadget, Don Adams, was playing Maxwell Smart for 5 seasons on the very popular Get Smart series, which parodied many of the tropes of the Bond movies. Mission Impossible, another hit that gave American spies the spotlight as the rotating crew of operatives was saving the day on network TV each week. So this is like the 60s American television, but then imported from England at this time were spy shows like The Avengers, Man from U.N.C.L.E., and The Saint, starring future James Bond Roger Moore. So all this is to say that spies were big business in the 60s, but it was then a legacy that was felt not just in references to James Bond, which were omnipresent in pop culture, like you said, but for the next 20 years, you have Charlie's Angels and $6 Million Man and MacGyver, even Michael Knight, you know, to a certain extent was kind of a secret agent. These people going undercover for justice of their episodic adventures. So with so many to choose from, Will, did you have a favorite TV spy? Or I mean, it would be Michael Knight, but do you consider him a spy or no?
Not really. This one's tough for me because, like, I have a lot of favorite, like, undercover cops and officers where you could say what they're doing is spying. But when it comes to, like, espionage and all that kind of deal, my interests kind of merge, like Nick Fury. And I know, like, that kind of blends things because at this point, we really would only have the David Hasselhoff Nick Fury TV movie, you know? But I'm like, that's a spy to me. Like, even though James Bond is like the template, I never really got the whole, like, you're in a suit, you don't wear a mask. So really, everyone should know who you are. Like, James Bond didn't work for me necessarily, but I understood undercover cops. Sometimes they changed their look or how they walked or their mannerisms, you know? But like spies themselves, I just don't have a favorite. It really does come down to like Shield, and they're not really spies. I don't know. How about you?
Well, for me, it wasn't a live action character. It was watching Danger Mouse, another British import, on Nickelodeon. And I know you didn't end up watching Nickelodeon as a kid. So in the 80s, you probably weren't seeing a whole lot of Danger Mouse going on. But for me, the idea of a British secret agent, that's where it was introduced to me. Like the idea of this character who's working for an organization and he's kind of the guy who knows all the tricks and he can always get out of a sticky situation. But specifically the theme song, I remember running around my house reenacting those opening credits, singing loudly, Danger Mouse, while I'm trying to escape imaginary exploding bombs. It was very Batman the movie from the 60s series, you know. And then Nick at Night, you know, I saw the Get Smart reruns as well, but really, Danger Mouse was always my spy.
While it would become much more of a trend in the 90s, animated adaptations of live action film properties certainly had a history in both Saturday morning and syndicated cartoon blocks of the 80s. For example, The Karate Kid had a one-season series of adventures starring Daniel-san and Mr. Miyagi, while Rambo and even RoboCop had cartoons based on their cinematic exploits. More appropriate for the kids, however, would have been the likes of the real Ghostbusters, Ewoks, and Droids. It's worth mentioning that Thunderball co-writer Kevin McClory, a constant thorn in the side of the legitimate makers of James Bond movies, Eon Productions, because he had limited rights to make adaptations of the characters in the Thunderball book, did attempt to get an animated series called James Bond vs. Spectre off the ground in the late 80s, but it never happened. What did happen, however, was James Bond Jr. So let's explore what it was all about in our elevator pitch.
So James Bond Jr. was a syndicated animated series that debuted in the fall of 1991 with 65 episodes produced by Murakami Wolf Swenson. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because they were the studio responsible for the long-running Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles animated series. So this show was airing on TV at a time, as we said, when the James Bond movie franchise was very dormant. The last film, License to Kill, starring Timothy Dalton, was released in 1989, and then nothing. And the series focused on a character named James Bond Jr., who is said to be the nephew of Agent 007 and attended the Warfield Academy School, though he left the campus daily to thwart the evil schemes of scum, or saboteurs and criminals united in mayhem. Now, young Bond, as he was often referred to, was outfitted with crime-fighting gadgets by IQ, who was the grandson of James Bond's supplier of field weaponry, Q. Also in the mix was Gordo Leiter, the son of CIA agent and Bond associate Felix Leiter. Other students included the girl holding a torch for James, Tracy Milbanks, and her nerdy friend Phoebe, and the stuck-up rich boy Trevor Noseworthy IV. The students seemed to also be chaperoned on many field trips unsuccessfully by Buddy Mitchell, who was himself a former FBI agent. But most episodes began with a trip to a new country, where an evil scum villain would be stirred up trouble. Speaking of which,
The recurring troublemakers of the series were mostly based on existing villains from the James Bond franchise of films, but to the extreme. For example, the larger-than-life Jaws now had a fully metal mouth that made him look like Trapjaw from Masters of the Universe. Dr. No was a green-skinned mutant. Knick-Knack didn't quite look like Hervé Villechaize, but had a tiny body and giant head. Even Goldfinger was involved in a series of schemes, joined by Oddjob, who traded in his tuxedo for a Run DMC-style tracksuit, pork pie hat, and gold chains. Other original baddies for the series included the pirate Walker D. Plank, mind-controlling Dr. Derange, and appearing to be a female version of Arnold Schwarzenegger, Barbella. There are many more to be discussed, but first we have to talk about the merchandising blitz for James Bond Jr. that included video games, novels, comics, action figures, and more. Adam, did you buy any of these?
Oh yeah, you better believe it. I mean, I do remember how excited I was again by this series itself. And then for some reason, even though I grew up all throughout the 80s seeing this happen, I was like, they made action figures for this cartoon? Like for some reason, I was just amazed when I walked into Toys R Us and saw these neon pink backer cards, hanging on the pegs. I was like, what? It was a really cool logo and everything. So I only bought two. We're back to the whole cop scenario. So I had the normal James and then the scuba diving James variant. But no bad guys. I didn't buy anybody for him to fight. The crazy thing was, though, with the standard James toy, he had a gun molded to his hand and like a taking aim action. There was like a briefcase that went around it, and then the gun would pop out of it. You're just like, what? Like, I don't understand, because there were no guns on the TV show, but they were very prominent on the toy, backer cards and all that kind of stuff. Speaking of which, there were dress up items where you could be James Bond Jr., at least one. And I don't know if you know about this, Will. It's called the Hot Shot CD player. And this was a portable CD player, but it was fake. It wasn't functional, but it was like a holster that you put onto your belt buckle, and you could wear it and then take it out. And it had a CD weapon that had like a buzz saw etched into it that would launch out. I was amazed to see this actually appeared in an episode. Like this was a real toy that they worked into the series, but it also had, as part of like the structure of the CD player, a bright blue cap gun. And so the gun pops out and you could actually shoot people, right? And on the box art, it's James Bond Jr. taking aim at some bad guy with the CD player on his belt buckle. And again, how did they get away with this? Because it felt like parent groups were taking aim, if you will, at weapons-based toys at this time. So it's just crazy to me that they're like, yeah, CD player with gun. Come on, kids, get your gun. Yeah, but still a very cool toy.
That wasn't a gun. That was what you called anti-shock protection. I didn't have any. I remember them. I certainly do, but you got to remember, this was the extreme era. Everything in the toy aisle was pink and neon and all that. It was just more of the same. It was like Toxic Crusaders or this. And I kind of remember these as like straight to clearance toys. These were a mainstay at KB. They didn't last long at Toys R Us, but KB, they sat on those things a while. Even though it's a very toyetic concept, that was never really enough for me. Like, I wanted a James, and I'm like you with the confusion of the gun, but I also noticed they made it like red. So I always assumed they were downplaying it, where maybe it's like a trank gun or a stun gun. Like, I never felt it was supposed to be lethal, but like the quick draw action, I think the package says shoot from the hip action. That was always fascinating to me. But one thing that kept me away from buying it was the fact that the gun was molded in his hand. Because then it's like, I can't have James playing baseball. It's like, why do you bat with your gun, James? It makes me feel more comfortable. It's just like, you can't do much like that. My imagination only goes so far. But I will say, in recent years in thrift hunts, I have been looking for a basic James. In fact, I can't remember if I ever found him. But I'm not going to call it a grail, but that is something where, like, when I see it, I'm like, okay, it's time. Because, like, visually, he fits in with like like the Burger King Kids Club. It's one of those, like, there's not a lot of detail there. He could be any 90s character. So I just like his visual more so than him being James Bond Jr.
Well, I'm so glad you brought up the Burger King Kids Club because one thing I just want to, it's not a cheer or a jeer, it's just an observation. But at this same time, the Burger King Kids Club in their pantheon of characters had a lab coat wearing, crazy orange hair having, glasses kid named IQ who looked almost identical to the IQ. He looked like the younger brother of this IQ from James Bond Jr. And I always found that strange, but that's not the only character design that seemed to reoccur later, because also in the series we have Dr. No, and we mentioned he has green skin and he has kind of this like armor suit sort of thing that he wears. And just a few years later, we get the Iron Man animated series as part of the Marvel Action Hour or whatever. And the Mandarin looks just like Dr. No from James Bond Jr. They just like, oh, we're just going to reuse this design. It looks the same, and there just must have been something in the air, so there was something in pop culture that we're just not making the connection.
Well, I actually did some research on that, like for this episode, and they said that that was a trend that they commonly did in the 90s for formerly Asian characters, because when they were created, they were always such like harmful stereotypes that like when they brought these concepts back, they're just like, oh, we can't do that. So make him green. So that was like the reasoning. It's almost like, oh yeah, the Hulk's green because gray was too expensive. And then it becomes this iconic thing. Well, all Asian characters have to be green now because then you won't think of them as like Asian.
So interesting to look at the world of James Bond Jr., how it was all set up. But we went back and watched it. We checked it out. So we got to find out what we liked about this world of espionage with our cheers. Well, we got to start out with what really is probably the catchiest element of it, and that is the theme song.
Yes.
I refer to it as White Soul Singing Lady, And it has very distinct lyrics, and it's memorable and catchy with the tune, and the premise is explained very clearly. He learned the game from his Uncle James. Now he's heir to his name. That opens up a lot of questions that I think we're going to talk about in Cheers. But also the end line is James Bond Jr. chases scum around the world. And that's all that happens in this series. So it doesn't get more clear than that. Plus the clips they use from the episodes are action packed. So I feel like they're not selling you something that isn't part of the show. They didn't do an original. I mean, you would think they would do it like a James Bond opening with like silhouettes. Obviously they can't do naked ladies, but they do something. But instead you're just getting real footage from the show, and it makes it look as good as it looks when you watch it, whether you find that good or bad. Or just passable.
I do agree, and I love that like the timing of the song doesn't allow you to be confused about what you're watching. By the time you can utter, what show is this? Bond. James Bond Jr. What is it about? Look out, he's coming through. If you're just patient, all your questions will be answered.
Yeah, so it's very effective that way. But also, as an introduction to the world of James Bond for younger viewers, I think the series does its job. Like, as we stated, there's several memorable villains that if you go and graduate to the movies, the live action films, you will see them in the flesh and you'll recognize, oh, it's that character. And then the younger analog compatriots, to James Bond Senior, we call him that now, they're going to be very familiar to the kids too. So I think as a premise for saying, let's keep James Bond alive or bring a new generation in, I think it does accomplish that.
Oh, definitely. Like, that's my main cheer for this show, is that it kept the property relevant during a down period, and it planted that seed for a new generation. Nobody looks back fondly on this show. Nobody's like, oh man, that was my favorite show. If anything, it's the kind of show our podcast was built for. But like, we all knew of it. If we were flipping the channels, when there was no James Bond movie, there was James Bond Jr. there, and you're like, you'd watch it for a minute and a half, and then you turn on to like Smurfs or something, you know? So like it did what it needed to do. It's kind of like, and I ended up having to eat my words on this one, but I always said that Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., we're back to S.H.I.E.L.D. now. I always said Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. was never gonna last more than like 3 seasons because I felt it was only designed to keep the audience satisfied until the next Avengers movie because they weren't cranking them out 3 per year at that point in time. At that point, we'd had one Avengers, I think, and then we had Winter Soldier because Winter Soldier lines up with season 2 of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And I was like, okay, this thing will be done by Civil War. You know what I mean? And then it went on to have like 7 seasons or whatever. So it's like I was completely wrong. But James Bond Jr. is that thing to me. And they said that's why like the Broccoli's were cool with it. There's always that weird ownership stuff with the Bond franchise, but like they knew this was like the prime time of like animated syndication. They wanted to get some of that like international money because this is one of those shows that like it was a blip on our radar, but I like to think maybe it was more popular abroad. You know, like Action Man. Action Man came out here, nobody gave a crap, but Action Man's important in the UK, so I could see like an Action Man, James Bond Jr. block, that kind of thing. That could have been very lucrative internationally. It's like Shusha. Not everything works in America.
Just a quick tangent on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., though. My son, he's seen a handful of the MCU films. We watch him, he asks questions, all of that. But he's 12 years old. He found Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. streaming, and he has watched every season and loves it. Like, he'll just take a whole Saturday and binge it. And, like, for whatever reason, this show connected with him, and I was not expecting that to ever happen for anybody, let alone a kid many years later discovering it.
It's one of those shows, and it's like, we have to do this now because it doesn't fall within our range of shows we cover, but it's like, it's one of those shows like every Trek spinoff where it doesn't get good until season 3. If you watch the first 2 seasons, it looks like it should have been a weekend syndication show. And once they're like, okay, this is part of the MCU, then you're like, okay. And then it takes a turn and is no longer part of the MCU. And you're like, oh, what was that investment for?
Yeah, it's like Inhumans and Ghost Rider and all sorts of stuff. You're like, what?
Yeah.
But yeah, so very, very fun that has endured. I will say my last cheer for this series is just that, we started out talking about gadgets and how that was a big part of any type of spy role playing we were doing. And every episode, IQ has several new gadgets that he has created, and he takes a minute or two to explain it and demo it for James. And it feels like they really spent a long time coming up with those. A lot of times it's just like a new thing on his watch, or like I said, the CD player in the episode, the CD that shoots out is not a buzzsaw to cut up bad guys. It says it will stick to anything and be a homing device. So he could just launch it out, but it was a boomerang CD. So he could either make it stick to something or it would come back to him in his CD players. That, of course, they always pop up, later into the plot to help James complete his mission. That's the whole point of setting it up. But at least they set it up and then used it. And every episode had something new. And that takes a lot of thought. And I like that.
See, I don't know if this is a cheer or a jeer, where it's like, it's a cheer in that, like, I agree with you there. But as toyetic of a concept as this was, I was surprised there's not more toys. Like we were talking about last episode, this is one of those properties where I would totally believe there are like 2 more waves that were released in South America because there is such an emphasis on the gadgets. And while like it's not a small wave, that's why this is probably a jeer, where this is that weird property in that it is made and feels like it was designed to sell toys. Like it feels like a program length commercial, but it happens to be based on a pre-existing thing. Like in the 80s, like yeah, G.I. Joe existed, but they weren't fighting Cobra. He was just a guy with a beard and a kung fu grip. The story came in the 80s, which helped sell those kind of toys. So it's like I watched this show and I'm like, oh, that car would make an awesome toy. That watch would make an awesome role play toy with a little buzzsaw to pop out, you know? And it's weird because Hasbro was involved in the production. And that always kind of surprised me in the sense that these weren't like typical Hasbro output. To see these carded, to see the execution, I would swear this was a Playmates line. Where like Playmates is big on accessories, but not articulation, that kind of deal. This should have been like Cops, like the last episode. There should be a bunch of toys that we find in thrift stores. We're like, oh yeah, that's from James Bond Jr. But instead, it's this almost throwaway show on a pretty iconic property. It would be like letting Deke make a Doctor Who cartoon. And it's just like, oh yeah, just don't worry about that cartoon. But you're like, it's Doctor Who. It's like 70 years, you know, like, so that's the confusing thing about it. Like, it does the franchise a disservice, but for the time and for what was going on, it understood the assignment. It's very confusing.
Yeah, I will tell you this, so there actually was a role play watch that shot little missiles out. So they did make that along with the CD player. So your instincts were right. And they did make the generic sports car for him to ride in as a vehicle. But on the Hasbro front, the only thing that may tip you off, oh, a Hasbro, is on the back, they had a secret mission file card. And it had the technology like on Transformers where you needed the red strip to put over it that it would reveal like the path that James was supposed to travel or whatever. So they did have that element to it. But here's the thing, Will, you already got the ball rolling. So why don't we get into our jeers? Boo! 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 Will, take it away.
It's just such a throwaway show. And it's so typical of Deke of the era. You know, like, I've brought this show up before, but it's Beverly Hills Teens to me, which is just like, if you saw it, you'd be like, I think I've seen this. What's that show called? Because unless the theme song's blaring in your ear, it's a very generic show. It's a boring show. Like, it's not exciting. And we've talked in the past how, like growing up, I didn't watch weekday afternoon cartoons, but I was all about weekday morning cartoons that I was watching as I got dressed. And they usually put some real crap on in the morning. So it was like James Bond Jr., Mighty Max, which actually gets kind of good near the end. But like, I watched James Bond Jr. religiously every day. This isn't one of those shows where I'm like, yeah, I kind of knew about it. I watched that season and I remember nothing about it. Nothing sticks with you. It wasn't even good enough to make me want the toys. And I want everything. You know, like when I think of the toys, the memory that stands out to me is it was the first time I had ever seen the worst execution of soft goods ever. IQ's lab coat is just like a flimsy, almost like vinyl scarf that like goes around his neck to make it look like it's long, but like the sculpt is really just like a suit jacket almost. Like it looks terrible in the photography. It looks terrible in real life. And I feel like IQ was the one that always like warmed pegs. So that just put like more of a bad taste in my mouth. As I was saying before, not only does it do the Bond name a disservice, it just does 90s cartoons a disservice. Cause like it's a piss or get off the pot thing. What are you gonna do? Are you gonna sell me toys or are you gonna like uphold this 007 legacy? And it did neither.
Yeah, well, and to your point, like it looks like it should be by Deke because of how lackluster it is, but the fact that it's from the people who did the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon, which was very popular, it seems like they would have had some ideas. Now, the ideas they had they just repurposed. Like there is a character in there, Phoebe. She's just Irma from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. The character of Tracy is basically just April O'Neil. Like there's nothing distinct about them, but it's just like the sort of generically attractive girl and her nerdy friend. And then they have humanoid Michelangelo in Gordo. I guess he's more actually probably Mondo Gecko because, in the toy, he has a skateboard that shoots a missile and he's just kind of a surfer dude. So they just kind of repurposed a lot of things there. But then when they came up with the extra villains, like not the ones based on the movie characters, you're also kind of like, okay, well, there's a guy with like a metal helmet head thing that runs into people. There's, all the villains are super generic. There is one that was really frightening, which was the Chameleon. And obviously there's a Spider-Man character called the Chameleon. And this guy, they say he had mechanical implants put into his face so that it will change his face to look like anybody. But it is horrifying how they bring it to life and how his like face distends and everything before it transforms. So there's like weird choices that are not appropriate, but then there's boring choices for everything else. The only thing that I would say is kind of a cheer/jeer is they don't do a lot of them, but they do like a next generation Goldfinger, who is, instead of Goldfinger, it's his attractive daughter, who is voiced by Kat Susi, who was the voice of Janine on the real Ghostbusters. So that's cool. She's probably the best character of, the new original ones, if you want to call it that. But I will say this, like with the generic villains, it's also like the opposite of what I said about Cops last episode, where every episode is, or every new plot, you don't know where it's going. It may be overcomplicated, but at least it's unique. This show is completely formulaic. Like it starts out and it will show you, okay, here they are at the school, or here they are going on their field trip. And then there's the Trevor character who's being a jerk and he's stuck up and everybody kind of rolls their eyes at him and he has some selfish thing that he wants to accomplish while they're on the trip, and that's always the B plot. And then a scum villain will just happen to be in the same place they are. He's like, oh, that's this guy. I've got to stop him. And then he takes off. And then by the end, they all come back together and Trevor does something stupid and looks like an idiot trying to accomplish his selfish goal. And then that's the end of the episode. Oh, and I should say, James meets a new girl that he's attracted to every episode. That's also in the theme song, that he saves the girl. It gets boring very quickly because 65 episodes of the same show over and over again.
And the love interests always have pun names like the women in the movie. So like Lotta De Niro and things like that. Like they couldn't be sexual, but like it's the same trope. But when you mention the like some of the characters were just kind of like reused or whatever, you almost have to wonder, were they reused or ripped off? Because something I found was that the show was developed by Deke. That Robbie London at Deke, he had an exclusive contract and he waived it so that he could sign with Eon, and he wrote the series Bible for the show. But for reasons that nobody understands, they switched to Murakami Wolf, and he still retains a created by in the credits, even though they apparently spell his name wrong. So it started at Deke and it looks like Deke, but like Wolf is the one that brought it to market, But like you were talking about how like boring it gets, it's too cutesy in that like, why is everyone at this school related to someone we know? IQ didn't have to be Q's grandson. He could have just been a really smart kid, and then James Jr. could have been like, oh, you remind me of this guy who works with my uncle. The fact that like it gets on down to like Felix Leiter's son is there. Like, it's like, is this Muppet Babies? We're too smart for TV. If it were like present day, there would be all this lore about why are all these kids at this one school? What is so special about this school? Is something going on there? Because they said it used to be used for like training for spies. So it's got all these like passageways and stuff. But like watching the show, I'm like, there's more to this setting than they ever explore. Like, is it witness protection almost? Is it to keep the loved ones safe of the like spies? It's very strange. There's a lot of potential there that's not explored. Instead, we get, like you were saying, this rinse and repeat rhythm. I will say, though, I think it's the first cartoon I ever watched that had a cold open.
Yeah.
So that was cool to me. But other than that, like, yeah, it's just a boring show.
Yeah, well, we're not addressing the elephant in the room, Will, and that is everybody's question.
The artificially inseminated elephant.
Why is he James Bond Jr. if James Bond is his uncle? James Bond is almost never mentioned in the series. I think very briefly talks about his uncle James in the pilot episode.
Bond, James Bond.
Which he repeats ad nauseum. Bond, James Bond Jr. Even the bad guy said, Bond Jr. Like, everybody says it like it was contractual. You cannot just call him James Bond. But for all intents and purposes in this universe, it's almost as if James Bond doesn't exist, because all the scum agents know young James Bond. They know James Bond Jr. He is the one that thwarts their plans. They never say, just like your uncle, foiled this plan, 5 years ago. Here you are again. Like, there's almost no reference to James Bond. MI6, there's nothing going on there. Like, he's not even like installed undercover. Why does he have this training? Why does he have these abilities? Why is he able to go up against adult villains with high-tech weaponry who are very dangerous? And Buddy Mitchell basically supports it. It's like, oh, James, we know to trust you because your uncle is James Bond, but you're James Bond Jr. There's no even attempt at explanations. Over 65 episodes, it feels like they could have done something. They could have had one episode where we see James Bond from behind, or we see him on a phone or something. He's like, when I had to adopt you all those years ago, like anything, but nothing. And we didn't expect it at the time, but it sticks out. And I think every kid had that question. James Bond's his dad? No, his uncle.
I always kind of felt like Scum was like a subsidiary. Like, James Bond is busy with Spectre. Scum is who his nephew deals with. But like, there is the theory that like Scumlord was actually Blofeld, which then like that blows my theory out of the water. But yeah, they said that like James Bond was an only child with like no siblings. So it's like, who is the mother of this child? But, well, that's what Fleming said. The Broccoli's said they kept this intentionally vague. That like their stipulation was they never wanted to imply that James had a wife, an ex-wife, or that he had a child out of wedlock. So they were just like, oh well, we'll make him a nephew. But my deal is the whole concept would have worked better as a modernized, these are just the young James Bond chronicles. Him being the nephew, we don't gain anything from that, especially given we never meet James Bond. So It should have just been the adventures of young James Bond, or the junior adventures of James Bond, instead of being James Bond Jr.
Yeah, there's no reason not to just make him literally young Bond. That's all it needed to be, because like you're saying, they have their reasons, but James Bond was married on Her Majesty's Secret Service. That's the plot of that movie. He gets married, his wife dies, it's referenced later, he visits the grave in a few other movies, so it's just like, he did have a wife that there's no reason he couldn't have. But I know, like, at this time especially, that would have been very convoluted for something that they're introducing to kids. But I think there had to have been some way to make this show more interesting, Will. It was bright, it was flashy, there was action, but maybe for it to endure, it needed something more. So let's show up and save the day as the Show Doctors. All right, well, here's my pitch. For years, I've had this idea. How do you make this work? We're talking about, should it be young James Bond? Well, that's what it is, except for a few semantics, with the words, and that just kind of confuses us. James Bond Jr., yeah, it's James Bond babies. That's what it is. But I feel what they really needed to do to tie it into Bond movie continuity is it needs to be called The Bond Squad. And it still stars young people, but they are all the illegitimate children of James Bond that he has sired while traveling the globe and betting women even on every continent. Now, the odds are not in his favor here, Will. 007 owes a lot of child support. There's no way everybody was using protection. So you have an international group of young adults. They're a Captain Planet-like team who find out who their father is and decide to follow in his footsteps while trying to track down this deadbeat dad in between their missions. That's the ongoing B plot of the series. Where in the world is James Bond? And they're always one step closer to finding him, but never quite get in touch with dad. They're working through their daddy issues together. They're talking about it. The conclusion of each episode is maybe a recap of one of his adventures, a recap of a movie or something. But obviously, this is more like an Adult Swim show. This is a modern.
Is this for kids?
They could leave it intentionally vague. If you're going to dumb it down, these are all kids that James Bond helped, and they come together and they want to be the Bond squad. But what we all know and read into is, no, these are his kids from Japan and Sweden.
Like it's a team of Short Round, you know? Like, he just, everywhere he went, he picked up a kid side, like Wolverine.
Yeah.
He picked up a kid sidekick. But we know the truth.
Yeah.
Oh God. I love when you were like, not everyone was using protection, and I thought of that like Austin Powers scene where it's like, condoms? Those are for sailors.
Well, they shed the filthy buggers. They go from port to port.
Right? I like it. I'd watch it. I mean, my whole thing, I don't have a lot to do here in that the show did what it did. I just think they lied to us. So I would strip the junior off of it. Because, like, James Bond has no real continuity. It resets depending on the actor. They felt they needed to be, like, beholden to all these movies that had come before. But, like, that's not how that franchise would evolve anyway. So, like, this would never matter. So just go balls to the wall and just, this is James Bond. This is just like, it's before he gets his like license to kill, because that was actually a stipulation. He was never allowed to be called 007 Junior because the 007 means he can kill. So like, they weren't going to put that on a kid. There was a guy whose job was to make sure it was still kid friendly. So like, the women could never wear anything like too sexual or like that accentuated their curves. There's actually, I want to say it's like issue 5 or issue 8, because there's like a 12-issue Marvel series that was out the entire duration of the show. And like, you look at those covers and you're like, oh, they didn't get the memo. But like in the show, all the girls had to be like cute but frumpy, like no over sexualization. There was no drinking, that kind of deal. But like, it had to be for kids. And I think it pulled it off. It asked so many questions that are just never answered. Like the gym teacher who was former FBI. That's what I'm saying. There's like more to this setting. He's former FBI, but now he's this gym teacher at this special academy. But also TV tropes calls him an example of the token minority trope because he's the only black guy, but he's not voiced by a black actor. They didn't even try. Like they didn't even get a white actor to be like, give us your most offensive inner city black voice. It's just like, my name's Rick. Like, so it's almost like, did they make him black in post? But he also has this weird, like almost generic G.I. Joe design where he'd have some name like Hard Case that you never saw in the cartoon, but they needed to fill out that wave of figures. Like, it's just wasted potential. So honestly, I would feel a lot better about the show as it is if we just call a spade and just say it's James Bond. That's my only prescription.
Fair enough. Well, Will, next time around, we are going to stay in the world of adventure, but get into live action once again. We recently had released into the world Captain America Brave New World, which featured a returning character of Isaiah Bradley, played by Carl Lumley. And wouldn't you know it, he played a superhero previously in the 90s in a series called Mantis. And we gotta talk Mantis. Well, it just feels right. We want to get in to see what this was all about. So stay tuned. Find the show where you can find it. Maybe you have it all on DVD. Maybe it's your favorite. You guys will tell us all about it. But in the meantime, you can stay connected with Remember That Show on social media at Remember Show Pod. You can find me at Hoju Coolander. Will, where can they find you?
You You can find me everywhere at William B. West or my website, westweekever.com.
And if you want a little bit more nostalgia, you need that hit of retro on a daily basis, you can go to theretronetwork.com, which is also the home of Geekster Media, and you can see the various articles and other podcasts that are being released. Lots of fun stuff there. But of course, we are excited to keep bringing you what we do here on Remember That Show? So tell your friends and spread the word. We will say that our Cops episode saw a significant jump in our listenership. So word is getting out. Let's keep that rolling as we go into 2025. But until next time, we're changing the channel.
This has been a presentation of Geekster Media.